I put scoreboard in the wrong place. Ha ha ha. It's in day 2, not day 1. I will fix this later. No, not notes. Review it too. Okay. What questions do we have? What things are we confused about? So many.
So many. With the insert tab, how to get it to change team 1 name.
So how to get the team name to change?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm curious where you can start.
Where to start? Where to start?
Yep. Best practice Java.
Script. JavaScript. So this is the thing you're going to do. You're going to say Java. You're going to walk to a meetup and be like, man, I'm learning Java. And they're like, really? Like Java 8? Or are you learning like struts? And you're like, what are you talking about? Like the thing in the browser, they're like, oh, you mean JavaScript. JavaScript and Java are 2 different languages, and they have nothing to do with each other than the fact that they both start with the same first 4 characters. So yes, so where to start, and then where to start with our JavaScript. Cool. Other things?
I labeled all my buttons different and just tying them from HTML to the JavaScript.
Mm-hmm. How to find the elements in our JavaScript.
What main is not defined? Are you trying to pull his stuff?
Main is not defined. Let's see what that error is. Also, how to debug errors. Anything else?
Oh, NPM install. For what it's worth, I would start
Yeah.
I'm a little confused. Like when we hit add 1, subtract 1,
Mm-hmm.
we saw how to make that count in the button.
Mm-hmm.
But how would I make add 1 and subtract 1 affect the zeros under team 1 and team 2?
That's the how do I do the homework question? Right. That's the challenge for you to figure out. Cool. Okay. So let's start with where to start and where to start with our JavaScript. Same as always. First the HTML structure and content, then styling. Now what we're adding in is then JavaScript. Right? So you should have at some point probably a commit that is, here's all my HTML structure that has team 1, score, text that says update this score, buttons for add, subtract, right? Just your HTML structure, just like we've done when we were laying out a page. Then CSS that styles everything, flexbox, sizes, margins, etc. So it looks as much like, I closed it, as much like this as you can, right? We're not looking for perfection, just is the My Scoreboard large and center, and do we have team 1 and a score and team 2 and a score? And these things here and the buttons. And then some way to type in a new name here and some way to type in a new name here, right? You should have a commit that just has this, so you have this in your browser, and then we start with some JavaScript. Yeah. Right, so this is what we've been doing up to today, right? Up to like, hey, we know how to do flexbox and responsive, right? What's new here is the button tag and the input tag, right? For buttons to click on and inputs being places to type. And then we start with our JavaScript, right? So if I were looking at this, I might ask myself, what is the simplest action I can start with? All right, what's the simplest kind of thing that I want JavaScript to dynamically do on this page so that I can kind of figure out?
It's going to be the counter.
Yeah, I would probably start with the counter. I might start with, can I find this add 1 button and click on it? Not even can I add, something, just can I write some code in my editor so that when my page is loaded and I click on this add one button, I see something. I get a console log, right? Can I click on add one and see a message in the console saying, hooray, right? I know that I've now associated my web page, my DOM, and my JavaScript in such a way that when I click on a button, I see a thing happen, right? That's my entryway into now when I click on that button, I want something to change, right? So when I click on this button, what do I want to have happen?
11.
I want to see this score here add one, right? I want to see this 10 change into an 11. And if I click on this button, right, this 10 should become a 9, this 11 should become a 10. All right. So maybe I start working on this add button and get it to say hooray, and then I get it so when I click on this add button, this 10 changes to an 11, and a 12, and a 13. Now I could then go work on the subtract and get that 10 to a 9, 8, 7, 6, or 10, 13, 12, 11. Or I can go make this add button affect this number. Right? So either I'm going to do add and subtract on team 1 and get that done, and then maybe attempt this, or maybe at that point I'll jump over and I'll get add and subtract 1 for team 2 to work. Or maybe I'll get all the add buttons working first, get all the subtract buttons working next, then get all the update buttons working next. It's quite often in these things, it's 6 on one, half dozen on another. It's going to be, sometimes if you do all the add buttons first, you'll see a pattern that will help you. Sometimes if you do add and subtract first, you'll see a pattern that will help you. There's no one answer to how do I attack this, right? Other than finding what you think is the simplest thing to tackle on this page, and I would start there, right? We talked about designing our page from top to bottom, right? We started with my scoreboard and then team 1, team 2, right? And we kind of style that way. For this, I would look for either the core concept of the page, that's where I'm going to start with my JavaScript, or what I think the easiest thing to latch onto to get some kind of reaction happening in my page. So I might start with, how can I find this add one button, right? And I can't answer that for you because it's going to depend on how you laid out your page, right? Depending on how you laid out your page is how you're going to write that query selector code to go find that add button, right? So somewhere in your JavaScript code, probably inside of that main function, you're going to have a line that says query selector something to isolate this add one button. And that's going to give you back a DOM element, and then you can add an event listener onto that for a click that calls some function that does something. Right? That's very similar to the counter that we did in lecture this morning. Right? And then you might do something similar for the subtract one button here. Right? But the behavior for that's going to be different, right? It's not adding to this number, it's subtracting. And then you get to decide how do you want to store where this number is, right? Maybe when the page first loads, there's nothing here and there's nothing here. And when you add the first score, this changes to a 1, right? It's probably not usual that when you first load some app that's going to track scores, it starts with 10. That's likely you probably should really start with a 0, right? This is just giving you a design view. It doesn't mean that this has to start with 10. Right, so you might start with blank, you might start with 0. If you want to start with 10, that doesn't bother me. But if this was a real app, it would probably start with blank or 0.
Will it automatically go into negative numbers, or do you have to?
I don't know. It's going to do whatever your code's going to tell it to do. Code is only going to do exactly what you tell it to do. Right? The code is not smart at all. Programming in code is like talking to the most simple person you've ever spoken to in your life. They only will do exactly what you tell them to do. If you tell your code to jump off a cliff, it's going to jump off that cliff, right? If you tell your code to keep subtracting until the score is negative, guess what it's going to do? It's going to go negative, right? You have to code for that condition. If you don't want the score to go negative, you have to have code somewhere in there that prevents it from going negative, right? That's the great thing, and the not so great thing about coding is that you have to explain to the system how to do everything. Now, fortunately, we don't have to define how query selector works or add event listener works, because the fine folks at Google added that for us. But they don't know anything about the scoreboard, right? That's our business logic, right? That's the thing we got paid to make this work. So we have to describe how all that works. So likely something in your HTML is going to give you enough that you could both style this button individually as well as query select for it so that you can get a hold of it, so that you can add an event listener to it, which points at a function that when clicked affects this element here.
So you have to add a class to the button.
Maybe. I could probably give you at least 12 ways of doing it. And I bet in a class of 8, there will be at least 4 different ways of doing it. You will have found and used 4 different ways of identifying just that button. Yeah, you can add a class to it. What if you added a class to whatever this container is? And then this is a different button, right? So if adding a class seems easy, try that, see what happens. Because you know that you can add a class to it and style it that way. So you can query select by it. Right? That's going to be in all of these coding things, right? There's no one right answer.
I'm confused.
Right? So did you start with laying out your page?
Yeah.
So does your page look like this?
Yeah.
So I don't have to show me. So now,
I'll show you.
can you write some code in your JavaScript like we did in the demo in class that identifies this button so that when you click on it, you get a little console message in your console. Right? So if you look at the code or the notes or the video from class, right? We talked about how to get we talked about the fact that selectors work for our CSS and they work for, link those videos later. Right? They work for styling the CSS and for being able to querying.
Right.
So if we go back, unfortunately I put it in day 1. I will fix this later. I'll move it to the right place. Right. So if we look in our main.js file,
That's what I'm looking at right
that's my implementation of scoreboard. I need to go into where did that code go? Oh, here it is. I have 2 cortex sides. That's why I'm getting so confused. All right, so if we look at the code that we did today in class, we have these buttons. They're class first, class second, class third. And in our main.js, we defined a function called clicking that gets called because every time we find a button using query selector, we add an event listener. So we ask our document, hey document, please take this CSS selector and apply it to our page and find the first thing on the page that this is true for. So this is going to ask for the first button that has the class first. And it's going to give it back to me in the variable called button. And then I can say, hey button, whatever's in this button variable, please listen for the click. And when that happens, call my function clicky. Then I can say, well, let the variable button2 be a query selector for the first thing on the page that's a button and has the second class. Put that in a variable called button2. When we button2 add event listener for click, also called clicking. Do the same thing for button3. The button that has the class third goes into a variable called button3. We ask button3 to listen for a click, and when that click happens, call clicking. Now, it just so happened in this demo, we wanted the same thing to happen for every button. So the same function works for every button, because we want the same behavior to happen when any of those buttons are clicked. Is that true of this? No, we want different behavior, not necessarily. We want different kinds of behavior, right? When I click add one here, I want to add one to this score. When I add one here, I want to add one to this score. When I click subtract one here, I want to subtract one from this score. When I click subtract one here, I want to subtract one from this score. So that might mean I need how many query selectors? Probably need 4 query selectors. How many functions might I need? I might need 4 functions.
I have a quick question on this organization. So,
Mhm.
A lot of the setting of variables is inside the main.
Mm-hmm.
The other functions that we put for clicking up or down or whatever should be outside of that function. What you're saying.
Yes, they could also be inside, but that's a little bit more of an advanced topic. You can have functions defined inside of functions. But for now, I would suggest that your other functions be outside of main.
But all the variables we want to keep inside the main.
Yes.
Or does that also matter?
You will see as you go how those different decisions work, right? Because it kind of depends on how you're going to use this, how you're going to update these, right? So where is the current score for team 1 going to be saved, and where's the current score for team 2 going to be saved? What inside of this is similar to that? Do you have a pattern here that seems like something that would be similar to the score for team 1 and the score for team 2?
The let message equal we click so many times.
Yeah, and where does that message come from?
Click count.
Click count, right? So maybe the simplest way is we have 4 query selectors for 4 different functions for how many different versions of click count?
Add, subtract.
Yeah, but how many different numbers do we need to keep track of?
4.
Do we? No. How many different numbers are we keeping track of?
At least 10.
2. Team 1 score and team 2 score. So maybe we need let team 1 score equal 0 and let team 2 score equal 0. All right. And what do we do inside of the add function for team 1?
Let team one score plus equals 1.
Yeah, and then we do something with it, and we assign it something, and then we update the DOM. And we do a similar thing for subtract for team 1, and we do a similar thing for add for team 2. So maybe we end up with 4 query selectors, 4 functions, 2 count variables, 2 score variables. See what that does. So we probably need, right, we have 4 different things we want to happen with a click. Click here, click here, click here, click here. That probably means that we could use 4 query selector, document.query selector. Find this button, find this button, find this button, find this button. Each of those being called a document query selector. Right? That's going to give us 4 variables. Right? as we return something, we put them in a variable. And then on each of those, we have an event listener that says, hey, when this thing is clicked, call some function. When this thing is clicked, call some other function. When this thing is clicked, call a third function. When this thing is clicked, call a fourth function. Each of those functions is going to do something to either team 1 score or teams 2 score. So that implies we probably have 2 different variables that track team 1 score and a variable that tracks team 2 score. So I might imagine that your code has 4 instances of calling query selector and 4 instances of adding an event listener and 4 functions to handle each of those clicks, and then 2 variables, one that tracks team 1 score and one that tracks team 2 score. Right? But at the beginning, what I would start with, instead of trying to bite all that off at once I have my HTML done, can I make it so that when I click add 1, I can at least query selector that, event listener that, to a function, and console log, I did it.
Will you do a demo of that?
That's the very first step. So let's come back here, app, data, scoreboard, review at 2. I'm not going to do all of the HTML and CSS unless somebody wants to paste their HTML and CSS into Slack. So when you paste things into Slack,
Is it basement?
no, even better, right built into Slack, you can just click this plus and say post a code or snippet, and then just post the code right in here. And then if you're really fancy, right, tell me that's HTML or CSS, and it will format it nicely. The other way is if you're ever typing a code snippet, a single backtick is, let x equals 5, right? That will format it as code. But if you're going to do a multiple thing, you can hit 3. Oops, sorry. You can hit 3 backticks, and then you have to hit Shift Enter to not have it post. Let x equals 5. Shift Enter console.log x, and then end it with 3 ticks. That will post a multi-line thing, but it's probably easier just to do plus code text or snippet, right? Body, color, red, right? Create snippet.
Somebody posted that.
I
Yeah.
sent it to you.
He sent it to me. It's down here, and it's right?
And then you
So-
can-
Whoa!
I think I sent it the wrong one.
Nope. You sent me this. Here's your HTML.
Let's see,
So I think you've sent me your.
Sent them both.
I think you sent me the HTML twice.
Oops.
Okay. Let's go on here. So let's grab this. So
Why is it HTML person again?
no, you posted this. Second time you posted this CSS. So here's the HTML. So very soon, I'm going to be more specific about indentation of code. So, like for the first week or 2, I'm not going to get on you very much, but there will come a time where I will reject code that is not indented. So I did post
That's sloppy.
the tool set. Yeah. Yeah, it makes it hard to read and it makes it hard to reason about the indentation.
Nice.
So you should get to the point where you can type.
Is that with Pretty?
This is with a thing called Formatter. The problem though is that it doesn't always do a perfect job. So let's just quickly. Eventually, you all will be at the point where yeah, you'll just be able to type all these bits here. And then see, the other thing that it helps you do is it helps you realize that like my UL is not closed.
It still isn't closed.
Yeah. Yeah.
What when you first make it all move?
So, oops. So you know that if I select a line, if I highlight some lines and I hit tab,
Tab, but I don't know.
Shift tab.
Shift tab?
Shift tab is
We'll get it now.
is unindenting.
Probably the same right now.
Yeah. So let's see what's going on here. So here's the UL, here's an LI. This button has a button, and button, button. Okay, so the UL is there because I forgot to type a slash. Here we go. So since the first one is working, I'm just going to take this one and duplicate it, because this one should be a team 1 and a team 2 and a team 2 and a team 2. Oh, this is 1. Okay. So let's see what this looks like when we npm start it. Ah! What did I do?
Again, star.
Really? And then I put a T on the next line. Great. Okay, cool. Let's grab the CSS for this. CSS. Okay, cool. So, what we'd like to be able to do is identify this add button right here. Right? So let's take a look at our HTML and find that add button. So that add button is right here. Right? And it has a class of add. So that means that in my main.js, what I can do is I can say is document query selector thing that has a class of add. I'm going to get rid of the question mark thing that comes by default. Right? So I'm going to make a new variable. I'm going to make it a constant. It could be a let. It doesn't have to be a const. But since I'm not intending on changing it, I'll just make it a const.
How do you slash out code?
You highlight the line and hit delete, or you figure out what the select delete line.
Are you asking me to
Command is.
comment it?
Yeah, to comment.
Just 2 slashes.
Or if you highlight the line, you can do command slash, and that will toggle comments on and off. It does.
It works in one
I think it does.
Yes. So
Well,
I highlight.
but you're using Atom,
Yeah,
right?
it works in Atom.
We're using.
It should also work in VS Code.
Control
slash. Yeah. So if you highlight a whole bunch of lines, control slash toggles commenting. So, right, I'm asking my document, which is my entire page, please query for this selector. Please use this .add selector and go find me the first element that that's true for. Right? So this is the .add class. Right? So we're looking for the class add. And if I console.log add button, I'll see in my console whether or not I found the thing I'm thinking I'm going to find, right? So back here, you will find that if you haven't already been leaving the developer tools open while you've been coding HTML and CSS, you absolutely will for JavaScript. Hey, look at that. My console log spit out this DOM element, and look, as I highlight it, it's the add button, right? This object here, this variable, is representing this. Right? That's coming from the fact that I asked the document, please query for the selector, give me back the first element on the page, starting at the top, flowing through the document that has the class add. So now if I want to know when it's clicked, I would like to see a message. I then have to say, hey, add button, please add an event listener for the click event. And when that happens, please call the method add one to team1 score. Make a nice long name for that function. Right? But I haven't defined that function yet. So for Ben's question, I will make another function, add one to team score is a function, and all it's going to do is console.log, I did it. Hooray for me. Right? All that function is going to do is just console log something. So this line of code finds the first thing, a p tag, a UL, a button, an input, doesn't matter what it is, that has the class add. We put the result of that in a variable, and then we ask that variable, that object, hey, please listen for a click, and if you ever hear one, I want you to call this function. That function is defined up here. This is how we define our function, right? Const name of function equals arguments, if there are any, arrow, brackets.
What are the arguments there?
In case we want to receive some information. So the thing is that all functions that are an event listener automatically get an event variable. So you can put that in or you can leave it out. So it's optional. If you're going to use it, you put it in. If you're not, you can leave it out. JavaScript is not picky about whether or not you declare there are arguments to your function. If somebody calls your function with extra arguments, they just get dropped on the floor, right?
You mean arguments that don't apply to that situation?
So every time we call a function, we either supply arguments or we don't. Every time we define a function, either we accept arguments or we don't, right? So it's like you walk into a restaurant and you order a taco, right? And you give them money and they give you a taco, right? What if you just walked into a restaurant and they just gave you a taco? You didn't have to give them any money. That's like calling a function with no arguments. You still get something. No, I wish there was, right? So you can have a function that doesn't take any arguments, right? And you call it with no arguments, it does what you want it to do. If you have a function that has arguments and you don't supply it any, all those arguments will be undefined. It'd be like, hey, I wanted some input, but you didn't give me any.
And that's if you do define arguments.
If you do define arguments, but the person who calls your function doesn't give them to you. So you the programmer, said, hey, there's this function called buy a taco, and one of its input is money, right? And if someone comes into your store and be like, I want a taco, but they don't give you any money, the money is undefined, right? Like I wanted money, my function, tacos takes a money argument, but you didn't give me any money, so that variable money is undefined, right? It could also be that you're running a taco place, right? And you have a function called tacos that doesn't take any arguments, right? But just gives out tacos, right? People can come into your store and take tacos, right? They called you, they didn't give you any money, or they can give you money and you're like, I'm just going to ignore that, right? So that's like having a function that has no arguments, open and close parentheses, no arguments, but someone's going to call you with arguments, you just don't get them, right? They tried to give them to you and you're like, no, I don't care, I don't want them. So every function, when the click happens, the browser is going to call your function and give you an argument called an event. It's up to you whether or not you want it. If you want it, right, you put it in the parentheses here. If you don't care, like I don't need it, cool, whatever, man, I'll just leave them out. But you can't get the event. If you want the event, then you just have to say, yeah, I want the event, I'll take it.
The event is a click.
The event is the actual click.
So for that code to function, then you need event in there.
Right now I don't need anything because I'm not using the event. Now I might use it eventually, and when I do need it, then I have to ask for it.
Okay.
Right? So right now I don't need the event. A lot of programmers, even if they don't need it, will define it because you might need it in like 5 minutes. So as a habit, if you're having a handler for an event listener, you probably want to define the first argument being the event. So if I've done this right now, when I click on this add one, I did it. Hooray for me. I know now that I've identified this button by class with a query selector. I've added an event listener to that button so that when I click, I call add one to team one score. And all that does is say, hooray for me. Cool. Now, what about this button over here?
Do the same thing, you gotta be constant add button,
All
query
right.
selector, class.
Yeah. So if I const add button document query selector for add, how is this going to be any different than this?
You gotta change the class, or you gotta make sure your class.
I might have to make a different class.
Or ID, or however you wanna identify that button.
Yeah. So maybe this is really add button for team one. Maybe this is going to be add button for team two. But these two selectors are the same. And we said query selector is always going to give us back the very first instance. So in our HTML, this button has class add, and this button has class add. So I have a couple of choices. I could change this class to say add for team one, and I could call this add for team two. Now they're unique, right? But I would have to change this, so add for team one, and this is add for team two. Now I have two different selectors, so I get back two different objects. Just to prove it, let's console log add button for team one here. Sorry. Add button for team one here, and add button for team two here. So that when I run the code, hey look, I got this button, and then I got this button. The first console log gave me this button, the second console log gave me this button. Because I changed my HTML to be more specific than just add. Right? I said this is the button class add for team one, this is the button class add for team two. In my JavaScript, I changed my query selector to be just as specific. And I get two different variables. So now maybe I say add button for team two, hey, add an event listener for a click for add one to team two score.
Then
Oh.
you have to define what add one.
Add one to team two score is a function that takes an event and it does console.log. Like Brittany, I did it again. All right. So now when I click on this button, I did it harangue. Like Brittany, I did it again. All right. So this is when I said we might need multiple query selectors, we might need multiple event listeners. So that's not the only way to solve this problem. Let's go back and just make this add and make this add. Right? Because if I go down this path, I'm going to have add for team one, subtract for team one, add for team two, subtract for team two. What if up here, as the parent to this entire section, I added a class up here? What if I did this? Can I write a CSS selector that makes this add one button light up? Yeah, if I do not team one space dot add, color red. Oh, I have some issue here.
It's team dash one, right?
Oh, yeah, I changed these. Yeah, I changed these. Add. We'll fix this up in a second. And did I call it team dash one? I called it team dash one. So if I say the selector is something with the class team dash one, and somewhere down deep in that structure there's an add class, that button lights up red. So if I add over here a class equals team2, then, oops, I can say team2 is color blue. Right? Now the buttons are different colors, which means in my JavaScript, this could be dot team-1 add and dot team-2 add. Right? So I don't have to go through and give every button its own class, because on the parent, I've added an identifying class for team1, which means that I can identify team1 add and team1 subtract and team1 update, and then team2 add and team2 subtract and team2 update. Right? This is the idea of having the nested structure. Right? So if I have something that groups all my team1 DOM together and I add a class to it, I can join these two things together, my team1 class and my add class, my team1 class and my subtract class. Not only can I use that for styling, I can also use that on my query selector for my getting my objects. So I would probably do something more like this than make 4 different classes for all those buttons. Okay. And we'll see why tomorrow as we dig in a little bit deeper.
So you just need all the add buttons dot add.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
then you select them for team 1, team 2.
Yep.
see.
I
That's
put
the benefit.
on a
So you don't have to
parent.
do add 1, add 2,
I don't have to have a button class, add 1 for team 1, add 1 for team 2, add 1 for team 3, add 1
you
for
still
team
need a
4.
class though, but you can identify it through the teams.
I add, because this and this uniquely identify that button, different than this class and add, right? If I highlight the add class inside of team 1, that will not match this button, but it will uniquely identify this button. Whereas .team2 space .add will uniquely identify this button. Right? Very similar thing will happen for subtract. Very similar thing will happen for this update, so forth and so on. Right?
What about so I put the figure class as score 1.
Mm-hmm.
How do you make that functional as a, because it's just labeled as 0 in HTML.
Mm-hmm.
How do you define that in JavaScript?
That I will leave as an exercise for the students.
Got it.
Right?
Somehow.
Is that at least on the right track?
Mm-hmm. So this is the thing you want to change, right?
Yeah.
So what tool do we have at our disposal for finding a thing in the DOM?
That's query selector.
Query selector. So we're probably going to use query selector to try and find this thing and then change it somehow. You have all the tools you have so far, the things we've done to find it. Right? So you got to find it, think about what it is, change it somehow. Right? And then the same thing for down here. So, right, since this has score, in his code, he has score 1 and score 1. Well, I copied and pasted, right? So that's probably not unique enough. So maybe, since we now have this wrapping thing, we can just have score and score. Right? This is team1 score. This is team2 score. Right? So it's a combination of making sure that your your HTML has classes that make things specific enough, and then using those in your query selectors to find them.
So you don't need a comma for the dot team 1-1.
No, that would be saying I want something that's team 1 or
Got it.
add. A space in between in the selector says team 1 at some point, and then somewhere anywhere deep in the nesting, something that has dot add.
Comma means or.
Comma is or. Team 1 or add. Right? So a comma is now saying find the first thing that's team 1 or an add. Right? So if I do this now when I'm clicking on team 1 and it's saying I did it.
Huh.
Because it said, hey, go through the DOM and find the first thing that's team 1, or if you don't find the team 1, the first thing that's got add.
So it
Well,
stopped at team 1 add doesn't work anymore.
It stopped at team 1 because it found this div.
Does that work too?
This add will not. Oh, sorry.
Or,
Yeah, or, because it's or. Yes, because the query selector is or.
So it doesn't work.
Yeah,
Oh.
yeah.
thank you.
Okay, we're
Yep.
on the right track, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Still
So,
to figure
just
out.
like when we were working on styling, once we had our HTML, okay, how do I identify the things to style? Now you're trying to identify how do I find the things to identify them with query selector so I can get back a reference to it. This add button for team 1, that variable is actually the thing in the browser that is that button. This variable, right, is in all sense and purposes exactly that button in the browser. That variable is exactly the thing that the user is clicking on. Right? Then I can say, when they click on it, go do this function.
That's the event listener.
That's the add event listener.
It could be when they hover, when they whatever. For now, it's click.
Yeah, right? If we say hover, actually we have to do, buttons don't have hover, they have mouse move.
Oh, okay.
Look at that, right? 150, 160, 200, 300, right? I'm just moving my mouse inside that button and events are happening like crazy, right?
That's cool.
So it's whatever you want it to be, right? If you want it to have them double click for it, right, then the event is double click. Then a single click does nothing, but a double click does.
Can you change like the amount of time that can pass between the two clicks?
Yes, but you have to code that.
Would
Right,
you be
right,
alright if we play with it a little bit where we make like add 1 click and subtract double click just so we can try different?
Yep.
That's okay with
Yep. Yep. You should be experimenting, right? A lot of the learning you're going to do is by trying. What happens if I change this? Like just like you did with Flexbox. What if I put a flex on this? What happens? Or if I take it away from here? What happens?
Well,
Or
my hobbies, I had all kinds of ugly stuff in there because I was trying to do like 10 and not just one.
Mhm. right? So if you end up with, a query selector to find this, and an add event listener, and a function, and one for here, and one for here, and one for here, right? And you can make these all say different things, right? Then you know that you have a place to host that code that says, add 1 to this value, subtract 1 from this value. Add 1 to this value, subtract 1 from this value, right? Where those values live, you've got a couple of choices, right? We've shown one way in the class demo how to have something that counts. Maybe that works for you. See if it does.
I mean, really, all we're using in this program is like 4 different things.
Yeah, you may. Yeah, we're pretty much using query selector, add event listener,
Like,
maybe for variables, and then some way of getting at the something of this DOM element, right? There's some attribute on this DOM element that lets us look at what's inside of it and change what's inside of it, right? We saw it's in the code we did in class, right?
Okay.
So those are all the tools.
So all we need is an add event listener, the add event listener, the DOM loader, and
Well, the DOM loader you get for free from AppApp, right? That's what just gives you this main function.
And don't delete a constant main because that's what I did. I got
Yep.
higher.
Yes. Right, because you get the const main and the DOM content loaded for free. That's just that, like the main is where you type your code.
Right.
Right, all your code that you want to have happen when the page loads goes inside of const main. So you're going to have query selectors to find things on the page, add event listeners to tell those things to do something when they're clicked or double clicked or scrolled or hovered or whatever, and then individual functions that describe that behavior of what to do when they were clicked. Right? We go back to our JavaScript basics.
What are the advantages of using let over var?
Ah, cool. Good question. Let me show you this, and we'll come back to that, and we'll kind of wrap up review two of that, right? So if we look at our main that we did before, right? We kind of have the same things, right? We have query selector and add event listener, query selector and add event listener, query selector and add event listener, and then there are some good hints in here as to how to deal with things that are county and updating things on the page, right? Inside of here and inside of here is pretty much, at least for the score tracking part, everything you need. You just need to reassemble it in a different way. So cool. Let's talk about var versus let.
Var versus let.
Yeah, var versus let. So, let's call this var versus let.js. So if we have a function, whoa, demo is a function. So here's an example. If we say let x equals 5, and then we'll say let y equals 8. So I have to show you an if statement to kind of demonstrate this. So we'll talk about if statements tomorrow. So what if we said, like, if y is 8, and we said let x equals 9, x plus equals 1, console.log x. And then we'll call demo. All right, so we let x be 5, we let y be 8. If y is 8, let x be 9, and then x plus equals 1. And then after the if statement, let's console log x. How many people think this is going to, oh, I can't do it here. How many people think this is going to output, how many people think it's going to output 10? How about 5? How about 6? Any other votes?
I was thinking it was going to add 8 and 9.
I need an arrow. So we make x 5. Y is definitely 8, so this is true.
Yes, we
Should be 10.
Maybe 10.
It's 5. Here's why. Because let defines a variable within the current lexical scope. What does that mean? Within the current set of curly braces. So inside of these curly braces, that is a different x than this x. This x and this x are not the same x. Even so,
So how do you define it? How do you define different? So
you tend not to do that,
okay.
right?
If you were to use var x, then does that define x locally?
Yeah. So if I say var x, see what happened when I changed that let to a var? I got 10. Because var is lexically scoped to the function. So when you say var in a variable, you're saying anything inside this function can see this variable. When I say let, I say only around the current set of squirrely braces am I declaring what this variable is. Right? Why is that important? Because you can have this var variable leak outside of the code you're working in, right? So let is just a more specific version of var. The how far that variable reaches is nicely scoped with a let. So let just says, hey, if I'm inside of a if statement or a for loop or a loop or inside of a function, that's where that variable is defined, even if inside someone in another function redefines it, right?
Okay. So what's a situation where you would use var over?
There really isn't one.
Good to know.
There really isn't one. Because the scoping of let is so clear, the cases where you're like, I want the looseness of var, there's usually another way of solving the problem that's better, right? The problem is when we defined the scoping rules for var, they were probably not as well defined. They were well defined, but they weren't narrow enough, right? So let came along and said, okay, this makes more sense. We're just going to scope it to the current set of squarely braces, whether inside of an if statement or a loop or a function, because we know, we can see where that scope is, where the scope for var is a little bit less defined. Sorry, a little bit harder to see, I should say. So you can get away with using var, but what tends to happen when developers use var is all of a sudden they see these weird side effects. Like, oh, I had this variable here called add, but then I had another variable over here. I used add over here, but why are these two things affecting each other? Well, the scope for that variable was too wide, and you didn't realize that using this variable called add over here was the same add variable you had over here. So let just kind of laser focuses where that variable is allowed to be used. That's mostly why. So these days, most developers are just using let because it's just easier to deal with than dealing with var. We didn't have let, but within the last couple of years in JavaScript. So var was just a thing, and then developers just dealt with like how weird dealing with var was. But now that we have let, most everyone's made the change. Like, I'm just going to use let everywhere. So it's a thing you should know about. You'll probably never see me type var in this class, and you will probably never type var in this class. If you've been a var JavaScript program to start using let, and 98% of the time it's going to be exactly the same for you. But that 2% of the time where it was causing you issues, let's going to save your butt. That's pretty much the difference. Cool. Are there other questions?
I did have a question that doesn't fix mine.
Same as always, first HTML structure, then styling, then JavaScript.
I just fixed my
Start with a simple action. How to get the team name to change? Basically the same thing. Right? Except, this is a little different, right? When we click on this update, we want to know what's inside of here. Right?
Like that right now and type stuff in?
This is some text. So we come back to scoreboard, review it too. Let me open this up. Let's close this one. This I think you defined as a text area. I think what we want really is an input. Hello, Adam. Come on, open.
Time for that new computer.
Yeah, I know. Come on, Apple. Is that tomorrow?
It's tomorrow at 1.
Tomorrow at 1? Okay, cool. Text. Oh, this is not the right thing. This is JavaScript basics. Why did you open that again? Oh, because I'm still in there.
What year is that?
I was in the wrong directory. So, text area is defined for like multi-line inputs, right? Like, hey, type your blog post here. If we're just talking about a value like a team name, the better thing here is to use an input. And then inputs are self-closing tags. So,
Do you even need the slash?
input. You don't. The slash is optional. So either with a slash or without the slash.
So why does it exist then?
The input?
No, the slash, why is that
Oh, because
an option?
It's just, I think it's just a styling.
yeah,
It's the
if we
same thing
were
for image, right?
It's the same thing for image.
Yes, the slash is
Oh.
optional. So if we were back not in HTML5 but in XHTML, that is HTML that is also strictly parsable by XML. So HTML hypertext markup language is a subset of XML, which stands for the extensible markup language, right? Kind of like every thumb is a finger, but not every finger is a thumb, right? Thumb is a more specific kind of finger. HTML is a more specific kind of XML. Right, XML is a broader language. HTML has more specific rules. So in XML, self-closing tags don't exist. Like that's just not a thing. So this is a thing. This is how you say in XML, this tag opens and closes with no content. But in XML, this is like, this is not valid. So some developers are like, I want my HTML to also be parsable XML, so they will add this optional
Okay.
self-closing tag. That's mostly why.
What's the point of having it also the thing you said?
Self-closing.
No, also parsable by.
Oh, XML, because there are XML tools that are really
Oh,
helpful.
okay.
That can do things to your code. It can parse it and look for errors and do
and
things
so
to
then
it.
if you have it so that it is also parsable, you can use those tools
Use
on
those
your
tools.
HTML code. Okay.
Yes. So now we see, right, we just have the input here and usable. So let's see if we can work with this input. Cool. So it has team1 team name. So in the console, I can say document query selector dot team1 dot team name. Hey, and I got that input, right? So if I have let name equal to this, name is this input. If I ask for the value of that input, see what I got? An empty string. Cohort xi. If I ask for name value again, look what's inside of that. Cohort xi. So when I click this update button, I need to go and find this element and ask for its value. And then I should be able to take this
And assign it to.
and go find this and change its something.
You
Right.
gotta rename that class too.
Yeah, maybe you're gonna need a class for that too. All right? Or if this team1 is an H2, I don't need a class for it. So I can just say, hey, query selector for team.team1 space H2. And that will give me this element. Right? So a lot of this is figuring out when I click on this, where's the thing I need to get? How do I need to change it? Where do I put it? Right? All of programming is essentially give me some input, let me do some process on it, let me put its output somewhere else. At the end of the day, that's kind of all there is to programming, right? There's conditions and loops and whatnot, but it's all about getting some input, modifying some data, putting it somewhere else. But where you put it somewhere else might be the next thing's input, right? Get some input, modify it, output it to this thing, which takes it as input and modifies and outputs it somewhere else, which takes a thing as input and modifies and puts it somewhere else. And maybe along the way, there's an if statement that says, hey, if it's Monday, send the output over there, and if it's Tuesday, send the output over there. Right? We're going to learn if statements and loops to go over things. But at the end of the day, it's mostly like, when I click on this button, I need to get this value and stick it over there. Right? Those things you now have the tools for. I would start just with the adding and the subtracting, and then worry about these things a little later. Right? Because you'll learn from this all the bits you need to do to get this, which is a little bit more difficult. Right? Because we're not just incrementing or decrementing some value. We've got to go get it and then put it somewhere. Right? So to show you, right, if I have the team name document query selector, right, we said .team1 h2. That's this. Right? If I say team name text content equals cohort xi, now you just have to connect all those pieces. Right? I can query selector for this element, and then I can change that object's text content to be something. Here I hard-coded it, but I've already shown you how to get it dynamically. Your task is to connect all three of those pieces. Click on the button, get the thing, get its value, find where I'm going to do it, change it. Right? Those bits are also in the demo that I did in class that the code is posted for. Yeah? Cool. Play around with it, see what you can do. Console log is your friend, right? Write some code and like, hey, did I get the query selector I wanted? Let me console log it, right? And see if the query selector I got is the thing that I want, right? Did I get the part where the team name is, or did I get the input that I want, or did I get the button I was expecting, right? Without that console logging, it's really hard to tell if the thing that your code did is the thing that you wanted. Probably next week I'll show you how to use, there's a debugger in developer tools. It's like console log supercharged, but that will just more confuse you all today than you already need to be.
We are severely confused.
Yep.
If you were wondering.
Yep. It will become less mud as you dive into it, right? As a hint, like try and go back, take the code today from the clicky example, see if you can recreate it. This is something that I have students do is make a new project in a new atom, keep the old project open behind it, see if you can write the code without looking, but if you get stuck, cheat and Alt-Tab over and look at the code for the one line you need and Alt-Tab right back and see how much you can keep writing, right? It's like having the cheat sheet underneath, right? But see how much of the test you can take without it. And if you need to peek at the code and come back and see if you can recreate what was in class, right? That will help you practice that that pattern of whatever it is we were practicing. Oh, we're doing query selector. Let me go see how Gavin did it in class, and then I'll try and recreate it. You might want to attempt that before you attempt this if you feel uncomfortable with the complexity of this. Just see if you can recreate the simple, hey, I clicked on a button, I changed the text, and I changed the counter that we did in class, right? Some will do the same thing and they'll follow along with the video. They'll try and recreate it. And then they'll like watch a little bit of the video, like, okay, I can recreate that step. And they get stuck and they like zoom along in the video to where we were doing that. Oh, that's what we did. Okay, cool. Let me continue on my own. All right. Before trying to tackle the homework, which is like a bigger version of that as well. Cool. Did we get to the last questions? How to find elements in our JavaScript, we said, right? But we need to find the input tag and get its value attribute to know the team name to use. Right? This is document.query selector. This is don't delete the main function. It is your friend.
I figured that one out.
Yep. Yep.
Appreciate it.
Cool. It is your friend.
It doesn't matter where that's at, though. As long as the document.add event lister DOM content is at the bottom, it doesn't really matter where the...
It needs to, main needs to be defined before it, because if you had this down here, you will get an error.
That's what I mean. As long as that DOM content loaded is at the very bottom, it doesn't matter. I don't have to say team.
Yeah. Main can be here. Just you have to define a variable before you use it, or you have to define a function before you use it. So these can be in any order, as long as main comes before this, right? Right, and add one to team score has to be defined here before we can use it. Now, the tricky bit is, because we're not using it directly, these could come after. Because this code doesn't get executed right away
It gets actually won't click the
when you
button.
click it. So they just have to be defined before you get to the clicking part.
Right.
I personally like to define functions and variables before I use them, even if I don't have to. So since this uses add one to team score, I want to see team score above it.
Right.
So I don't see it before it gets used.
Okay.
Cool. Okay. Let me
So